Pre-registered coordinates. Drone surveillance. No escape route. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution, somewhere deep inside Russian territory. Past the front line, past the range where most commanders feel comfortable, past what conventional warfare used to allow, sits a facility the size of a small town. Bunkers. Revetments. Underground chambers packed with 152mm artillery shells, glide bomb warheads, anti-aircraft missiles, and the propellant charges keeping Russian artillery firing at Ukrainian cities around the clock. This place doesn't appear on tourist maps. Its coordinates are classified. Its perimeter is patrolled by armed guards, monitored by radar, and protected by layered air defense systems positioned to intercept threats from the west. The Russian military planners who designed this facility believed they had thought of everything. They hadn't thought of the drone operators sitting in a converted warehouse 300 kilometers away, staring at screens, waiting for a weather window. I'm your host at East Alert, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Tonight, we're reconstructing one of the most audacious long-range strikes in the current phase of this conflict. A Ukrainian drone raid against one of Russia's most fortified ammunition arsenals feeding the southern front. A raid that began with silence, ended with a fireball visible for 40 kilometers, and sent shockwaves through Russian logistics planning still felt on every active axis of the war. The story doesn't begin on the night of the strike. It begins months earlier, in a windowless room where Ukrainian intelligence analysts were doing what they do better than almost anyone else in this war: watching. To understand why this target mattered, you need to understand what was happening on the southern front in the weeks before the operation. Russian forces had been intensifying their glide bomb campaign along the Zaporizhzhia axis. UMK converted Fab 500 bombs, Soviet-era freefall munitions fitted with GPS guidance kits and fold-out wings, were being launched at 80 to 90 sorties per day across multiple sectors. Each bomb required an Su-34 or Su-35 to fly within striking distance of the front, release its payload, and bank hard east before Ukrainian air defense could engage. The bombs were devastating. 500 kilograms of high explosive guided to within a few meters of their target. Ukrainian strongpoints, hardened positions, infantry assembly areas, all being systematically demolished by a weapon that cost relatively little but required one critical input: a massive, continuous stockpile of munitions staged close enough to airfields for rapid resupply. Which weapon was deadlier in this campaign? Russian glide bombs, artillery barrages, or Ukrainian FPV drones? Comment below. The answer shapes everything that follows. Ukrainian intelligence had been building a targeting picture for this facility across multiple collection cycles. Satellite imagery, including commercial imagery from Western providers, showed systematic patterns of truck traffic, rail deliveries, and the thermal signatures of munitions storage bunkers. The facility received regular convoy resupply from railheads to the north. Its air defense umbrella included at least 2 Panzer S-1 systems covering the western approach, a Buk M3 battery to the south, and a probable S-300 radar further to the rear providing long-range coverage. On paper, the approach corridors were covered. On paper, anything coming from Ukraine would be detected, tracked, and intercepted long before it reached the perimeter fence. Ukrainian planners weren't planning to fly through the approach corridors. They were going to fly through the noise floor. The concept of the operation hinged on a principle Ukrainian drone warfare units had been refining for 18 months. Not speed, not stealth in the traditional sense, but electromagnetic invisibility. The drones used in this raid weren't the fast FPV kamikaze systems famous in trench warfare. They were modified one-way attack drones. Larger airframes, carrying warheads between 15 and 40 kilograms, designed for ranges of several hundred kilometers. Flying low enough to use terrain masking, following pre-programmed waypoint routes that hugged river valleys and skirted ridgelines to stay below the radar horizon. The planning team had spent weeks analyzing gaps in Russian radar coverage. Every radar has a horizon. Every positioning decision involves trade-offs. A radar placed to cover the western approach creates a shadow zone to the north. A Panzer positioned to engage threats at medium altitude is poorly optimized for targets flying at 50 meters above a river valley. Ukrainian analysts mapped those shadows, those blind spots, those dead zones, and threaded a course through them like a needle through fabric. Stay with me. What happens in the next 18 minutes destroys an entire logistics network and changes the tempo of the southern front for weeks. The swarm was assembled over 3 nights, not in a single location. Dispersal was critical. Ukrainian drone units had learned from previous operations that concentrating assets in one staging area created its own vulnerability. Instead, operators were distributed across 4 separate forward positions, each team responsible for a portion of the total swarm. Communication between teams was minimized, timed, encrypted. The mission brief was compartmentalized. Each cell knew its own waypoints and timing window, but not the complete picture. 31 drones total. 11 carrying heavier warheads designed for direct penetration of bunker roofs. 14 carrying standard high-explosive payloads. 6 carrying thermobaric warheads intended for the open-air storage areas where propellant and smaller munitions were stacked under camouflage netting. The weather window had been the hardest constraint to solve. The operation required low cloud cover, both to reduce the effectiveness of optically guided air defense systems and to provide concealment from airborne observation. But it also required wind speeds below 15 knots at low altitude to keep the slower-moving drones on their programmed routes. The meteorological team had been tracking a pattern that would give them a 6-hour window. The launch sequence was planned down to 90-second intervals. At 11:47 p.m., the first drone lifted off from its concealed position. Then another. Then another. No radio traffic. No coordination calls. Just 31 autonomous aircraft climbing to cruise altitude of 70 meters and locking onto programmed headings, separated by carefully calculated intervals designed to ensure they didn't arrive in a clustered mass that would let radar systems build a coherent picture of what was coming. The Russian air defense network was active. It's always active. Radar systems rotate continuously. Data links between batteries, exchange track files. Operators in hardened shelters watch their screens for characteristic signatures of inbound threats. What they're trained to look for: the high-altitude ballistic profiles of HIMARS rockets, the distinctive radar cross-sections of Storm Shadow cruise missiles, the fast-moving blips of ballistic missiles descending from above. 31 drones flying at 70 meters, separated by 4 to 6 kilometers, following routes specifically designed to stay below the radar horizon. Each individual drone presented a radar cross-section not much larger than a big bird. In the noise floor of ground clutter, at low altitude, moving at 200 kilometers per hour, they were nearly invisible. How many vehicles and systems did Ukraine destroy in the resulting chain reaction detonation? A 23B-38 C-50? Hold that number. The answer is coming. At 1:14 a.m., the first anomaly appeared on a Russian radar screen at the southern Buk M3 battery. A faint track, low altitude, bearing consistent with an aircraft approaching from the southwest. The operator flagged it, queried the system, attempted to hand it off to the Pantsir battery for a closer look. The Pantsir radar, optimized for a different engagement zone, couldn't immediately acquire the track. By the time the two systems had exchanged data and built a clearer picture, the first drone was inside the battery's minimum engagement range. The Russian operator reached for the engagement controls. The first drone, already past the air defense perimeter, was 90 seconds from its target. It struck the eastern edge of the main bunker complex at 1:16 a.m. The warhead, a shaped charge variant designed to penetrate hardened structures, punched through the reinforced concrete roof of Bunker 7 and detonated inside a chamber containing approximately 40 tons of 152mm propellant charges stored for transfer to forward artillery positions. The explosion was significant, but contained. The bunker's reinforced walls and earth revetments did their job. They directed most of the blast upward, through the hole the warhead had created, in a column of fire and debris that rose 200 meters into the night sky. Subscribe to East Alert if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what happened in the next 4 minutes was a masterclass in the physics of sympathetic detonation. The heat signature from Bunker 7's detonation was visible on satellite imagery. It was also visible to the remaining 30 drones, whose onboard cameras. Originally intended only for navigation, we're now giving operators back at the forward command position a real-time view of the target complex. The timing was working. The lead elements of the second wave were now 17 minutes out. At 1:19 a.m., drones 8 through 14 arrived over the facility in a 4-minute window. These were the standard high-explosive payloads and their operators, watching video feeds from hundreds of kilometers away, were not aiming at the main bunker complex. They were aiming at the rail transfer point on the eastern edge, where 3 freight cars sat loaded with fresh deliveries that had arrived from the railhead to the north 48 hours earlier. The first drone hit the second freight car. The explosion was spectacular, but not a detonation of munitions. Ukrainian intelligence had assessed this car as carrying propellant rather than complete rounds. The fireball rose 60 meters, showering burning material across the adjacent cars and the open storage area beyond. The second drone hit the third freight car. The third freight car was carrying 120 Grad rockets pre-packaged for transport. What followed wasn't an explosion in the conventional sense. It was a cascade. 47 Grad rockets cooking off simultaneously in a freight car, launching in random directions, their motors igniting and driving them into the surrounding storage areas, the camouflage netting, the open-air stacks of ammunition waiting for transfer to the bunkers. The pressure wave from the Grad detonations propagated outward at the speed of sound, reaching the northwestern bunker cluster, bunkers 3, 4, and 5, in under 2 seconds. Bunkers 4 and 5, which Ukrainian intelligence had assessed as holding glide bomb warheads based on the weight of delivery trucks observed over the preceding weeks, suffered structural compromise from the overpressure. Bunker 4's roof partially collapsed, which is exactly where Drone 19's 40-kilogram thermobaric warhead went when it arrived at 1:22 a.m. A thermobaric weapon works differently from a conventional explosive. Rather than creating a single high-pressure detonation point, it disperses a fuel-air mixture across a volume of space and ignites it. The resulting deflagration, not detonation, deflagration, fills available space with fire at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. In an open field, the effect is devastating. In a partially compromised bunker containing glide bomb warheads, the effect was catastrophic beyond any Ukrainian planner's most optimistic projection. Bunker 4 detonated. Not the thermobaric charge. The bunker's entire contents detonated simultaneously. If you believe tactics win wars, type East Alert in the comments. Because what this moment proved about precision targeting and chain detonation physics will show up in military doctrine papers for the next 20 years. The sympathetic detonation propagated to Bunker 3 within 140 milliseconds, Bunker 3 to Bunker 5 within another 80. The interconnected revetment system, designed to limit blast propagation between structures, had been partially breached by the initial Grad cascade. In less than half a second, the northwestern bunker cluster ceased to exist as a coherent structure. The fireball that rose from the compound at 1:23 a.m. was visible from 42 kilometers in every direction. Thermal imagery captured by a Ukrainian surveillance drone orbiting at high altitude, outside the range of the facility's air defense, showed a column of fire 300 meters high and a thermal bloom that overwhelmed the sensor's calibration range. On the ground inside the facility, Russian soldiers scrambling to respond to the initial strike were caught in the open by the Grad cascade and subsequent detonations. Intercepted communications in the minutes following, released by Ukrainian military intelligence, captured the chaos in raw, unfiltered terms. Unit commanders calling for medical evacuation. Personnel reporting the entire northwestern quadrant inaccessible due to ongoing secondary detonations. An air defense battery commander reporting his Panzer system had sustained damage from falling debris and was non-operational. The Panzer was down. The remaining 12 drones, the ones that hadn't yet reached their target, now had an approach corridor with reduced air defense coverage. Their operators adjusted terminal guidance based on the evolving target picture. The original plan had concentrated heavier warheads on the main bunker complex. But thermal imaging now showed that the rail transfer area's secondary fires were threatening a fourth freight car that hadn't yet detonated. A car that satellite analysis had suggested contained a significant quantity of Shahed 136 drone components being staged for onward transfer to Russian Air Force units. 2 drones were redirected in flight. Their operators, watching feeds from 200 kilometers away, manually adjusted the terminal waypoints. The drones banked, reacquired their new aiming points, and descended to attack altitude. What would NATO have done differently in this targeting scenario? Comment your analysis. The targeting decision made here is one of the most debated choices in the operation's after-action reconstruction. The fourth freight car detonated at 1:31 a.m. The explosion was smaller than the Grad cascade, but more sustained. The Shahed components, including propellant and sheet metal parts of the drone airframes themselves, burned rather than exploded. But they burned at temperatures that compromised the structural integrity of the adjacent covered storage area. A long warehouse-style building that Ukrainian imagery analysis had flagged as containing anti-aircraft missiles. 2 more drones hit that warehouse between 1:33 and 1:36 a.m. The secondary detonations continued for 4 hours and 17 minutes. Emergency response teams attempting to approach the facility were turned back by ongoing explosions. Russian military fire services, called from the nearest substantial town, couldn't safely operate within 3 kilometers of the perimeter for the first 90 minutes. By the time conditions allowed controlled access, the facility had effectively consumed itself. Satellite imagery obtained in the aftermath, analyzed by multiple open-source intelligence communities and cross-referenced with Ukrainian General Staff assessments, told a story measured in hectares of destruction. The main bunker complex, 11 structures in total, showed damage ranging from complete destruction to roof compromise. 7 of the 11 were assessed as non-functional. The rail transfer point was destroyed, including approximately 120 meters of rail infrastructure and the loading equipment. The covered missile storage building was a collapsed structure. The open-air storage areas were ash and crater. The damage assessment, compiled over subsequent days from multiple imagery passes, estimated the destruction of munitions stockpiled to support 60 to 90 days of high-intensity glide bomb operations. Not the complete ammunition supply for the Southern Front. Russia has multiple nodes in its logistics network, and redundancy is built into the system. But 60 to 90 days of glide bomb munitions is not a minor tactical disruption. It's a strategic-level setback that cascades through every operational planning cycle depending on those weapons. In the 17 days following the strike, satellite tracking of Russian Su-34 and Su-35 operational patterns over the Zaporizhzhia sector showed a marked reduction in glide bomb sorties. Ukrainian ground forces in contested areas reported a measurable decrease in glide bomb impacts, most pronounced in the sector directly opposite the airfields that had depended on the destroyed facility for resupply. Ukrainian military sources, speaking through official channels, described the effect as significant operational impact. Cautious language that nonetheless confirmed what the imagery already showed. Russian military bloggers. The irregular but often accurate ecosystem of pro-Russian commentators who have broken news that official channels suppressed were less cautious. Several published assessments calling the strike a serious blow to Southern logistics. One prominent military blogger, whose analyses are closely watched by open-source analysts, wrote that the facility loss would require urgent redistribution of reserves from other theaters, implying the damage was significant enough to require borrowing capacity from elsewhere in the Russian logistics system. That has a second-order consequence. Every munition redistributed to compensate for the lost stockpile is a munition not available where it was originally positioned. The logistics cascade from a single successful deep strike ripples outward in ways that take weeks to fully manifest. There's something worth understanding about the human element of this operation. 31 autonomous drones, flying pre-programmed routes, executing a plan assembled over months of painstaking intelligence work. That's the technology story, and it's remarkable. But behind every aspect sat human beings making irreversible decisions under enormous pressure. The intelligence analysts who spent weeks mapping the radar blind spots didn't know for certain those blind spots would hold. They had assessed the probabilities, run the calculations, examined every available piece of data. But the moment the first drone lifted off, theory became reality, and there was no taking it back. The meteorological team that called the weather window couldn't be certain conditions would hold for the full 6-hour operation. The planning officers who decided to redirect 2 drones mid-flight toward the 4th freight car were making a real-time tactical decision with incomplete information. Under time pressure, aware that every minute the remaining drones were in the air increased the risk of loss. The obstacle that almost stopped the operation entirely wasn't Russian air defense. It was a technical failure that occurred 4 hours before launch, when the synchronization system linking the timing of the 4 launch sites experienced a software fault. The teams were supposed to launch on a coordinated schedule that would compress the swarm's arrival at the target into a defined time window. Without synchronization, some drones would arrive early and some late, potentially allowing Russian defenders time to reorganize between waves. The operators solved it the way Ukrainian forces have been solving improvised problems throughout this war, manually. Each team leader was given a calculated offset from a shared reference time. They synchronized watches. They launched by hand timing, each team leader counting down from a mark and launching their first drone at the calculated moment. The manual timing was less precise than the automated system. Arrival intervals at the target were wider than planned, with a gap of nearly 11 minutes between the lead element's strike and the arrival of the Grad targeting wave. That gap almost allowed the Russian Pantsir crew on the western perimeter time to reacquire and engage the second wave. They tracked 3 drones, achieved a targeting solution on 2, and fired. Both Pantsir missiles missed. The first lost guidance and fell harmlessly into open ground. The second detonated close enough to damage one drone, which veered off course and impacted outside the facility perimeter without reaching its designated aim point. 29 of 31 drones reached their targets. A 94% mission success rate, under combat conditions, against a defended target, executed by a team that solved a critical system failure 4 hours before launch using manual coordination. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. The after-action assessment conducted by Ukrainian drone warfare specialists identified 3 key lessons that have since shaped how subsequent long-range operations are planned. First, the value of disaggregating launch points cannot be overstated. The 4-site launch concept, despite creating the synchronization problem, also meant that even if Russian counterintelligence had detected and neutralized one site, 75% of the strike package would still execute. Survivability through dispersion. Second, onboard imaging, even when not originally intended as a targeting tool, provided real-time intelligence that allowed mid-flight redirects to maximize damage. Future platforms should treat the imaging system as a primary asset, not a navigation aid. Third, the thermobaric warhead variant proved disproportionately effective against partially compromised structures. The combination of kinetic penetration by the preceding conventional strikes with thermobaric follow-through created chain detonations that exceeded any pre-mission damage projection. On the Russian side, the post-strike analysis, reconstructed from intercepted communications, public statements, and observable behavioral changes, pointed to a fundamental doctrinal vulnerability. Russian air defense architecture prioritizes high-altitude, high-speed threats. The layered system of S-300, Buk, and Pantsir batteries is designed around the assumption that the primary threat arrives from above and moves fast. Low-altitude, slow-moving threats with reduced radar cross-sections exploit the seam between those systems' optimal engagement envelopes. Ukraine has understood this seam and has been systematically exploiting it for months. The strike on this facility was the most dramatic demonstration yet of how consequential that seam can be. The Russian military response, observable in subsequent weeks, indicated awareness of the vulnerability. Additional Pantsir systems were repositioned at other deep rear logistics nodes. Electronic warfare assets were moved to provide additional low-altitude coverage. Some storage facilities began using decentralized dispersal patterns rather than concentrating munitions in large bunker complexes. These adaptations have operational costs. Dispersion reduces efficiency, additional air defense assets pulled to rear areas create gaps elsewhere, and the administrative burden of managing a dispersed logistics network is substantially higher than managing a centralized one. Every adaptation Ukraine forces Russia to make has a cost. Every resource Russia commits to defending its rear is a resource not available for the front. The drone raid on this facility didn't just destroy munitions. It imposed a sustained administrative and logistical burden on Russian military planning that continues to be paid in operational efficiency. Real tactics, real consequences. East alert. The fireball was still reflecting off the low cloud cover when Ukrainian drone operators, sitting in their dispersed positions hundreds of kilometers away, were already documenting their post-mission assessments and preparing to redeploy. No celebration, no ceremony. Just the methodical work of recording what had happened, accounting for the one drone lost to the Pantsir near miss and the one diverted by the software fault, and beginning the intelligence cycle that would identify the next target. That's what this war looks like at its most technically sophisticated, not tank charges or infantry assaults. Analysts and meteorologists and software engineers and operators staring at screens, threading a needle through the electromagnetic spectrum, turning a fortified logistics node into a chain reaction fireball one careful decision at a time. Was this level of precision? Accepting 2 drone losses to achieve 29 successful strikes? The right trade-off? Comment what you think. The after-action debate inside Ukrainian planning circles was more complex than the headline result suggests, and your analysis might track closer to theirs than you'd expect. The answer to the tactical quiz: Ukraine's strike destroyed or damaged systems and vehicles assessed at 38 units. Counting the Pantsir battery rendered non-operational by debris, the rail loading equipment, 14 heavy transport vehicles caught in the facility's parking area, the covered missile storage building's contents, and the material aboard the freight cars. The number 38 falls in the middle of estimates from different analysis groups, with Ukrainian General Staff assessments trending higher and Western open-source analysts trending slightly lower. The precise figure matters less than the category. This was a strategic-level destruction event achieved by a tactical-level unmanned system operation. That's the defining characteristic of how Ukraine has fought this war, achieving strategic effects with tactical means repeatedly in ways that continue to redefine what precision warfare means in a peer-on-peer conflict. What's the broader lesson? Deep strike capability, applied against logistics nodes rather than frontline forces, can reshape the tempo of an entire operational theater. The glide bomb campaign that had been devastating Ukrainian positions along the Zaporizhzhia axis didn't stop after this strike. But it slowed, and the reduction in pressure bought time and preserved Ukrainian defensive capacity in ways that had downstream operational value. One raid, one night, one carefully threaded route through the radar blind spots, and a ripple effect that propagated through Russian southern front planning for weeks. Could Russian air defense have prevented this with different positioning choices? Almost certainly. A more forward-postured low-altitude radar network would have complicated or defeated the approach routes. But that network has to come from somewhere. Every resource Russia commits to defending its rear against drone penetration is a resource subtracted from air defense coverage of its frontline forces. Ukraine has understood this trade-off and has been systematically forcing Russia to choose: defend the front or defend the rear. You can't do both adequately when the adversary has long-range drone capability and is willing to invest in the intelligence preparation of the target environment. What would you have done differently? As either a Ukrainian planner accepting those trade-offs or a Russian logistics commander defending a facility you believed was secure? The answer reveals whether your instinct runs toward defense in depth or active denial, and which posture has been more effective in this conflict's current phase is itself a debate worth having. Will Ukrainian deep strike drone raids continue to reshape this conflict's logistics over the next year? Comment yes or no. And if you've been following this campaign, you already know where the evidence points. Subscribe to East Alert, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The facility is quiet now. The fires burned out in the small hours of the morning, leaving a landscape of collapsed bunkers, twisted rail infrastructure, and the charred remnants of munitions stockpiled over months of careful Russian logistics work. Satellite imagery in the days after the strike showed emergency clearance teams beginning the slow process of assessing damage, removing debris, and attempting to understand what had happened to a facility they believed was defended. The wrecks remain. Silent reminders that modern warfare punishes tactical overconfidence without mercy. No bunker is deep enough, no air defense thick enough, no radar network dense enough to stop an adversary that has invested in understanding your blind spots and has the patience, the intelligence apparatus, and the operators to thread a 31-drone swarm through the gaps you didn't think existed. Stay vigilant.